There were 3 chairs at the round table by the window, and only one of them was hers. The gallery was full by 7:30, the kind of full that happened when a Winnipeg winter kept people indoors long enough that an opening night became the most reasonable excuse to leave the house and feel, briefly, like a person who attended things. The room smelled of warm wool and white wine, and the particular dry heat of a building that had been a textile warehouse in 1908 and had never entirely forgotten it. Fern Calloway pressed her thumbnail into the pad of her opposite index finger and looked at the 2 empty chairs beside her and reminded herself that she had known, coming in, that this was going to be the arrangement. The chair on her left belonged to her brother-in-law, who was at that moment standing at the wine table with his second glass and his easy posture, the posture of a man who had never once felt like furniture in a room. The chair on her right was her sister's. Annette had been delayed at the hospital, where she was a resident, and had texted from the parkade at 6:42 to say she was coming, and then again at 7 to say she was still coming, and then not again, and Fern, who had driven separately, because Annette had warned her this might happen, had sat down at the round table alone and placed her coat over the second chair and told herself this was manageable. It was, on balance, less manageable than she had anticipated. She was not a person who minded rooms. She had spent 11 years as an architectural conservationist working largely in silence inside buildings that other people had abandoned, and she had developed in those years a practiced comfort with being the only person present. Empty churches, decommissioned schools, a grain elevator outside of Dauphin that had been scheduled for demolition until she had filed a report that used the phrase structural irreplaceability 4 times in 7 pages and made the provincial board feel, she was told later, quietly ashamed of themselves. She was good at being alone in rooms. She was less good, she was discovering, at being alone in rooms where everyone else was in a pair. She pressed her thumbnail harder. The gallery was called the Harwick. It occupied the full ground floor of a building on Arthur Street that Fern had visited once, 8 years ago, in a professional capacity, to assess a section of original brick that the previous owners had been considering behind drywall. She had recommended against the drywall. The brick was still visible in a long warm row along the north wall, and the current owners had lit it from below with small amber fixtures that made it look intentional, which it had always been. Fern noticed this the way she noticed structural things, without meaning to. The way her mother used to say made Fern look at dinner tables like she was somewhere else entirely. She was not, at this particular moment, somewhere else entirely. She was very specifically here, at a round table near the east wall, at the opening night of an exhibition she had been invited to by a colleague who had not, in the end, been able to come, and whose name on the guest list was the reason Fern was sitting in this particular chair at all. The exhibition was called The Weight of Staying. The placard at the door described it as a collection of works by a single anonymous donor, shown together for the first time. The works were oils mostly, large ones. They occupied the walls the way serious paintings occupied walls, with the particular authority of things that did not need you to look at them and knew you would anyway. Fern had looked at them. She had arrived early enough that the room was still setting itself up around her, and she had walked the perimeter slowly, glass in hand, before sitting down. The paintings were not cheerful. They were not meant to be. They were interiors, mostly. Windows, doorways, the corners of rooms, where light came in from somewhere outside the frame and landed on objects that had been left behind. A coat on a hook. A kettle mid-boil with no one beside it. A table set for 2 with 1 chair pulled out and 1 chair pushed in, and no indication of which had been occupied last. She had stood in front of that one for a long time. She had been standing there, in fact, when the room filled around her, and she had not noticed the room fill, because the painting was doing something she couldn't entirely account for, which was making her feel seen in a way she found both accurate and inconvenient. She was 37 years old. She had been engaged, briefly, to a man named Paul, who had been a sensible and kind person in most of the ways that mattered, and who had told her in September over coffee at the kitchen table of the apartment they shared on Corridon Avenue that he thought they had arrived at different ideas of what the next 10 years might look like. He had not said it badly. He had said it like a man who had rehearsed it and wanted to be fair. She had held her coffee and said very little, and then they had talked for a long time about logistics. The way people talked about logistics when the thing underneath the logistics was too large to address directly. He had moved out in October. She had taken the spare room and turned it into a study and spent November translating her grief into a report on a 1930s fire station in the North End that needed its original terrazzo floors assessed before the city decided they weren't worth the restoration cost. The report was very thorough. She had come to the opening tonight because staying home on a Tuesday in February felt, at this specific point in the specific shape of her year, like a thing she was no longer willing to do. She went back to the table. She sat down. The two empty chairs held their positions. She picked up her glass and did not drink. The man came across the room without appearing to be in any particular hurry about it. She noticed him the way she noticed load-bearing walls, which was to say she noticed him before she intended to, and then found she could not entirely stop. He was tall, with the kind of height that did not announce itself. He wore a dark jacket over a grey shirt with no tie. His shoes were good. He moved through the room the way people moved through rooms they had been in many times before, without looking at where they were going. He was not looking at the art. He was looking at the people in front of the art, which was a different activity, and suggested a different habit of attention. He stopped at the edge of her table. He looked at the two empty chairs. He looked at her. He did not smile, exactly, but there was something in his face that was adjacent to it, the expression of a person who had observed something small and found it quietly interesting. "Is anyone sitting here?" he said. His voice was even. There was a Winnipeg flatness to it, familiar, unhurried. "Both of them will be," Fern said, eventually. He absorbed this. He glanced at the coat on the chair beside her and then back at her face. "Would you mind if I stood at this end of the table for a moment," he said, "while I figure out where I'm going?" It was an unusual request. Fern, who spent a significant portion of her professional life making requests that other people found unusual, recognized the register of it. A person who asked for a very specific small thing instead of a large vague one. She nodded. He came around to the end of the table farthest from her coat. He didn't introduce himself. He set his glass down on the white linen and looked at the room from that vantage point, with the focused assessment of someone taking a measurement. "You were standing in front of the interior with the table for a long time," he said. He wasn't looking at her when he said it. He was still looking at the room. Fern kept her expression level. "I didn't notice anyone noticing. I was at the back. I wasn't particularly trying to be noticed. What were you noticing it for?" He looked at her then for the first time directly. He had a face that didn't give much away. Not guarded, exactly, but careful, the face of a person who had learned at some point that reactions were a resource and managed them accordingly. His eyes were dark brown or very dark grey. She would not be able to decide later. "I painted it," he said. The words settled between them. Fern set her glass down. "The exhibition is anonymous," she said. "It is? But you're here." "I own the building," he said, and then stopped, as though he'd become aware that he'd said it the wrong way and wished he could take it back and say it differently. "I tend to be at the building on Tuesday evenings. It wasn't strategic." Fern looked at him. "You painted all of them?" "Most of them. 3 in the north corridor are my mother's. I included them because they belonged in the same room." She would have found the logic sound. The past tense landed quietly. Fern heard it the way she heard stress fractures. Not loudly, but clearly. "The one with the table," she said. "The 2 chairs." "Yes. Which chair was occupied last?" He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had been asked the question they had been hoping wouldn't be asked and was deciding whether to answer it honestly. "The one that was pushed in," he said. Fern looked at her hands. "I'm sorry," she said. It came out in the voice she used with clients when she had to tell them the thing they'd been hoping wasn't true. Not soft, just true. He nodded once. He did not then make it easier for her by changing the subject. Her phone buzzed. It was Annette. "I'm so sorry, Fern, I'm so sorry. The surgery ran. I can't get there. Please don't hate me, I'll make it up to you." And then, 4 seconds later, "Is there wine at least?" Fern put the phone face down on the table. She looked at the 2 empty chairs. "My sister isn't coming," she said, "to no one in—" "And the other one?" "My brother-in-law. He's at the wine table." She looked across the room to where Colin was talking with great animation to 2 people she didn't recognize, a glass in each hand. "He's fine. He doesn't need a chair to have a good time." The man looked in the same direction. "He looks like a person who carries a room with him." "That's exactly what he does," Fern said. "I find it remarkable, frankly. I've never been able to figure out the mechanism." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "May I sit down?" Fern looked at Annette's chair. She looked at her coat on the other one. She moved her coat. "Yes," she said. He sat. He did not sit toward her, exactly, or away from her. He sat at the angle of someone who had been invited to the table, but understood the invitation was provisional. He set his palm flat on the white linen. He did not introduce himself. She did not ask. Her name was Fern Calloway. She was 37, and she assessed old buildings for the province, and she had, until September, been engaged to a man who had wanted different things, and she was at a gallery on a Tuesday in February because she had made a decision in November to stop turning down the rooms. She did not say any of this. She said, "The brick on the north wall, it's original." He looked at it. 1908, he said. "The building was a textile distributor. I know. I did an assessment here years ago." She paused. "I'm a conservationist, architectural." He turned to look at her properly. It was a different kind of looking than before. "You recommended against the drywall," he said slowly. "The report was filed under a colleague's name. I was a junior on the project. The previous owner showed me the report when I bought the building." He looked at the brick. "I used the phrase structural irreplaceability in the grant application for the restoration." Fern, who had not in 3 years heard that phrase repeated back to her, set down her glass. "Did it work?" "The grant came through in April." He looked at her. He had a small, careful expression that was doing a great deal of work in a very small amount of space. "The brick thanks you." She almost laughed. It came out of her as a small, controlled exhale, the laugh she used when she was in professional settings, and something genuinely funny had happened. He noticed it the way a person noticed a thing they had been hoping for. Colin materialized at her shoulder with a glass of wine, and the particular cheerful obliviousness of a man who read a room well enough to know when he was not needed in it, and made himself useful instead. He set the glass beside Fern's. He introduced himself to the man at the table with the frank handshake of someone born in Saskatchewan, then looked at Fern with an expression that said, "I will ask you everything later," and moved away again into the room. "Your brother-in-law," the man said. "Colin Park," Fern said. "He's a structural engineer. He's going to be disappointed he didn't talk to you about the building." "He can talk to me about the building," he said. "I'm here most Tuesdays. You own it, and you're here most Tuesdays. I work upstairs. The upper floors are office space. The gallery is." He paused. "The gallery wasn't in the original plan for the building. It was my mother's idea. She'd been showing in group exhibitions for 20 years and never had a room of her own." He looked at the north wall where her 3 paintings hung. "She died before I finished the conversion. We opened 14 months after." Fern followed his gaze to the 3 paintings. They were different from his. Softer, more light, less interior. One of them was a window, but the window looked out instead of in, and beyond it was a field in what she thought might be spring. The kind of field that appeared on the drive between Winnipeg and somewhere smaller, flat and open and patient. "How long ago?" Fern said. 3 years in March. "My father," she said, "was 8 years in January." She didn't know why she'd said it. It arrived out of her the way these things arrived sometimes, without permission. "He was a carpenter. The kind who built furniture, not houses. He thought buildings should last, and so should chairs." He was quiet. He did not then say, "I'm sorry," which was the correct choice, because "I'm sorry" was what people said when they needed to move past the moment, and he did not seem to need to move past it. "What did he think about old buildings?" he said. "He thought they should be saved if they wanted to be saved." She turned her wine glass a quarter turn. "He had a theory that buildings had preferences, that if you paid attention to how the light moved through a place, you could figure out whether it was trying to stay or trying to get out." She paused. "I didn't tell him that theory made the job sound significantly less scientific than it is." "Did it?" "He was probably right," she said, "about most of the buildings." His name, she learned 20 minutes later, when Colin came back with a refill and managed this time to stay long enough for an introduction, was Gideon Marsh. He said it the way people said their names when they had been told the name meant something in a room and had decided, before saying it, that they were going to say it anyway and let it land where it landed. Gideon Marsh. The Harwick was a Marsh property. She knew this from the heritage registry she used for work. She had not until this moment connected the name on the registry to the man at the table. She looked at him. He looked at her. He had the expression of someone who had said the thing they'd been deciding whether to say and was now waiting to find out what it cost. "The Harwick," she said. "Yes." "And the Meridian on Market." He nodded. "And the Pellet Building on Main." She knew this one because she had filed 3 reports on it over 5 years and had once stood in its basement for 4 hours while a city inspector tried to argue that an original limestone foundation was not in fact original. "My grandfather built the Pellet," he said. "My father added the East Wing. I have been, for the last 12 years, trying to convince the city that the East Wing was the only mistake either of them ever made." "The East Wing," Fern said, "is architecturally illiterate." He looked at her for a moment with the bright expression of someone who'd been saying this for 12 years and had not, until now, heard it said back to them in those exact words. "I have that phrase on a post-it note in my office, he said. Colin, who was listening to this exchange with the expression of a structural engineer, watching two people discover they have read the same chapter of a very specific textbook, excused himself with the quiet tact of a man who had been married to Annette Park for 6 years and knew a conversation that didn't need a third party. Gideon Marsh looked at the north wall. She wanted the gallery to be the whole ground floor, he said. My mother. She said the building had too much formality in its bones and the ground floor should be for things that weren't formal. He paused. I told her it wasn't a sound financial decision. She said financial decisions were not her primary area of expertise. He turned the wine glass half an inch with one finger. She was right. The gallery hasn't made money. It doesn't charge admission. I don't intend to change that. Fern looked at the 3 paintings on the north wall. The Springfield. What was her name? Evie. Evelyn to the registry. He said it quietly. She signed her work with just the E. She said a whole name on a painting was too much of a claim outside. The February night pressed at the high windows. Inside, the room moved with the careful warmth of a building that had been, in 1908, built to last. She did not that evening ask him anything else. She stayed another 40 minutes. Colin found her near the door at 9 and said that Annette had texted him 6 times, and he was going to go collect her from the hospital because she was, he suspected, sitting in the parking structure feeling guilty. He kissed Fern on the cheek. He looked back once at the round table where Gideon Marsh was talking to a man in a dark coat who appeared to be the gallery director. Colin's expression said something that Fern pretended not to read. She put on her coat. She walked past the north wall one more time. The painting with the Springfield was the one in the middle. The light in it came from the left. It landed on the windowsill in a long diagonal stripe, the kind of light that only happened in a specific week of a specific month. And whoever had painted it had been paying very close attention to the week. Fern thought about her father, who believed buildings had preferences. She thought that her father would have liked a woman who paid that kind of attention to a specific week in April. At the door, she stopped. She did not look back. She went out into the Winnipeg cold and walked to her car and drove home to the apartment on Corridon where the study was now a study, and the kettle was one, and Paul's coat hook by the door had, in November, been repurposed for a second of her own. She made tea. She did not press her thumbnail into her finger. She had been doing it all evening without noticing, and her fingertip was sore. She thought about the painting of the table. She thought about the chair that had been pushed in. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. She did not, in the 2 weeks that followed, drive down Arthur Street. She translated 2 inspection reports into plain language for a municipal committee that had requested documentation on 3 warehouse properties in the Exchange District. She attended a site visit at a 1920s school in Transcona and spent 4 hours on a frozen roof while a contractor explained to her why the parapet cornice was not in fact original. She was able to demonstrate, using 3 photographs from the city archives, that it was. The contractor thanked her without enthusiasm. She thanked him without sarcasm, which she considered one of her finer professional accomplishments of the quarter. She had lunch with Annette on a Thursday. Annette apologized again for the gallery opening. Fern said it was fine. Annette said, Colin told me you talked to someone. Fern said she had talked to several people. It was an opening. That was the activity. Annette had the expression she always had when she was deciding whether to push a thing. She decided on this occasion not to push it. She poured more tea. They talked about other things. Fern was grateful for the tea and the other things, and the fact that Annette, who had pushed her once too many times in October, had learned something from the experience. The email came on a Monday. It was from the Harwick Gallery, sent from an administrative address, requesting a brief consultation with a conservationist regarding a structural assessment of the building's original west-facing wall, which had, according to the building's maintenance records, shown signs of settlement in the exterior stonework. The email noted that Fern Calloway's name had appeared in connection with a previous assessment of the property and asked whether she would be available for a preliminary walkthrough. The email was signed, G. Marsh on behalf of Harwick Properties. Fern read it twice. She set her phone face down on the desk. She picked it up and read it a 3rd time. She replied that she was available Thursday morning. She drove to Arthur Street on Thursday at 9, with her clipboard and her camera, and her professional composure fully assembled. The front of the building was locked because the gallery did not open until 11, and she stood on the step for a moment in the grey February morning looking at the door, which was a good door. Original steel frame, replacement glass, a small heritage plaque to the left of the handle that she had not noticed in the warm dark of the opening night. Gideon Marsh opened the door before she knocked. He was in dark trousers and a sweater the color of old timber. No jacket. He looked as though he had been at the building for some time. He held the door and said, "Thank you for coming," with the directness of a person who did not routinely say things he didn't mean. He showed her the west wall. She spent an hour on it. He did not hover. He answered her questions with specificity and produced, when asked, a binder of original construction drawings from his grandfather's era that were in better condition than any drawings she had seen from the same period. She said so. He said his mother had kept them flat. She could hear, in the way he said it, that flat was the word his mother would have used. The wall needed pointing. The settlement was minor, the kind that happened to masonry buildings in the second decade of a Winnipeg winter cycle, and was entirely addressable. She told him this. He said he had suspected as much but wanted the documentation. She said she could have a preliminary report by the end of the following week. "I'll pay the standard assessment rate," he said. "You will," she said, and he almost smiled. They were in the north corridor when she stopped in front of his mother's 3 paintings again. "I looked up the name in the registry," she said. "Evelyn Marsh. She showed in Winnipeg for the first time in 1987. She was 23, he said. She drove from Brandon with 2 paintings in a borrowed pickup truck and talked a gallery on portage into hanging them in the back room. He was looking at the Springfield. They sold in a week. She drove back to Brandon and told my father she was moving to the city. He proposed the same evening. She always said it was cause and effect. Was it? He said he'd been planning to propose for a month. She said he'd been waiting to see whether she needed him. Fern looked at the Springfield. The light was coming from the left. "Did she?" "No," Gideon said. He said it without any sadness, just the straightforward delivery of a fact that had been understood for a long time. She didn't need him. She chose him. He knew the difference and thought it was the better thing. Fern thought about Paul, who had also thought about the difference between being needed and being chosen, but had come to a different conclusion about his own position in that arrangement. She did not say this. She looked at the Springfield. She was a very good painter, she said. She was. He paused. She thought you should only make things that lasted. She had no interest in making things that needed to be explained. The north corridor was quiet. The gallery was closed and the building held the particular hush of a space that did its best work in stillness. Outside, Arthur Street carried its ordinary Thursday morning traffic. Fern drove back to her office. She wrote her notes with greater thoroughness than strictly necessary. The preliminary report went out the following Friday. She sent it to the administrative address. The response came 2 days later from the same address, acknowledging receipt and approving the full assessment. At the bottom, in a different paragraph from the formal acknowledgement, there was a single additional line. "There is a section of interior brick in the basement that I'd like a second opinion on before we proceed. It may be nothing. It may be the east wall's original footing." She wrote back that she could come Monday. She came Monday. The basement was low and warm and smelled of old stone. The brick Gideon showed her was original, as she suspected, and the footing was significant. A continuous limestone course that predated the 1908 construction and suggested, if she was reading the evidence correctly, that the building sat on the footprint of an earlier structure from the 1880s. She told him this. He looked at the limestone and then at her. "What does that change?" he said. "For the restoration, possibly nothing. For the Heritage Registry designation," she looked at the course of stone, "it could change the classification entirely. A structure with evidence of a prior building on site under this specific designation threshold gets a different set of protections." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that good? It means no one can tear it down without a fight." She turned to look at him. "Whether that's good depends on whether you were planning to tear it down." "I was not," he said. "Then it's good," she said. He did not then say anything else for a moment. He looked at the limestone with the expression of a person who was thinking about something other than the limestone. His palm was flat against the old brick beside him. The same flat palm habit she had noticed at the gallery table. "My mother wanted to give the building to the city," he said finally, "as an arts trust. She drafted a proposal before she died. She wanted the gallery to run in perpetuity, no admission, independent board." He paused. "The city's heritage office hasn't been receptive. The designation we currently hold isn't strong enough to anchor the trust structure." Fern looked at the limestone. "A 1880s sub-foundation under a 1908 masonry structure on this block," she said slowly, "with documented commercial use and an intact original interior. Yes, that's not a minor heritage designation," she said. That's a category, a provincial listing if the evidence supports it. He looked at her. He had the careful expression of a man who had learned to be precise about hope. Does the evidence support it? I need to dig a little further into the registry, and I'll need to take samples from the footing for the material analysis. She looked at the limestone. But if what I think I'm looking at is what I think I'm looking at, yes, I think it might. He exhaled, quietly. He set both palms flat against the brick wall, the way a person steadied themselves against something solid when something large had become, without warning, possible. My mother, he said carefully, spent 9 years trying to get the trust structure approved. I know, Fern said. I pulled the heritage file last week. She paused. The previous assessment reports were thorough. They just didn't have access to this. He looked at the limestone footing. She would have wanted to see the look on the city heritage officer's face, he said, and his voice had, for the first time, a texture to it that was not entirely contained. Fern gave him the moment. She had learned in 11 years of delivering findings to people who had been hoping for them that the moment needed space. Then she said, I'll have the preliminary findings to you by end of month. He straightened. He set his hand briefly against the limestone, a single quiet touch, and then turned back toward the stairs. She did not then ask him anything further about his mother. She filed the gesture behind her sternum, alongside the Springfield and the explanation of the East Wing, and the way he had said she chose him, and she went back up the stairs and out into the Winnipeg afternoon. 3 weeks went by. She worked, she filed reports. She attended 2 site visits, one of which involved a very cold morning at a disused railway depot in St. Boniface and a city official who used the phrase cost-benefit analysis 7 times in 40 minutes, at which point Fern had used the phrase irreplaceable structural heritage 8 times in the following 20 minutes, which she considered a draw. Annette called on a Wednesday evening. Are you working with Gideon Marsh? She said without preamble. Professionally, Fern said. Colin looked him up, Annette said. He owns about 1/3 of the heritage buildings in the exchange. I know. Colin also said he was at the gallery table for quite a while on opening night. I know that too, Fern said. I was there. Annette was quiet for a moment with the quality of someone holding a very great number of things back simultaneously. She was a surgeon. She was good at it. Okay, she said. Okay, Fern said. I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. The report that you filed on the pellet building, Annette said. The one about the East Wing. Colin says the architectural community considers it something of a defining document. It's a standard assessment. He said the phrase you used, Annette. Right, Annette said. Okay, I'll stop. She stopped. They talked about other things. Fern, who loved her sister in the total unsentimental way, one loved a person who had known them since before either of them had been good at anything, appreciated both the stop and the other things. The material analysis came back in the last week of February. The limestone was mid-1880s. The documentation, combined with the physical evidence, was sufficient. She filed the preliminary designation report with the Provincial Heritage Office on a Thursday afternoon and sent a copy to the administrative address at Harwick Properties. The call came the following Tuesday, not from the administrative address, from Gideon Marsh directly, on the office phone. The heritage officer called me this morning, he said. I know. She called me as well. She said the designation is likely to go through. The evidence is strong, Fern said. I'd be surprised if it didn't. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, my mother drafted the trust proposal the winter before she died. She showed it to me in February of that year. She said she thought the building had earned the right to have a purpose beyond profit, and she wanted to make sure that was written down before she couldn't write it down herself. He paused. I have spent 3 years trying to find the mechanism to make it real. Fern looked at her desk, at the photographs from the basement, at the limestone footing silver grey in the flash of her camera. The trust structure, she said, becomes significantly simpler with a Category A designation. The legal framework is already built for it. I know, he said. I had a lawyer look at it this morning. Then you don't need me to tell you what the next steps are. No, he said. I called to ask. He paused. The pause had the quality of a person deciding in real time how to say a thing. I called because I wanted to tell you, rather than have you read it in a filing. And I wanted to ask whether you would meet me at the building on Saturday. Not as a client. I'd like to show you something in the gallery. Fern pressed her thumbnail into her fingertip, gently. What time Saturday? She said. Noon, he said. The gallery is closed on Saturdays. It'll be quiet. She was there at noon. He was there already, as he had been at every other meeting, with the quality of a person who arrived early as a default mode. Not out of anxiety, but out of the belief that being on time was the least you could offer a building. The gallery was quiet, in the way galleries were quiet when they were empty, the particular hush of rooms full of objects that did not require an audience to be complete. He led her to the north corridor. He stopped in front of the Springfield. He had, she saw, moved it. The painting was on the same wall, but it was centered now, where before it had been positioned at the end of the row. The two paintings on either side of it had been rehung to give it space. She wanted it in the center, he said. I kept telling her the arrangement worked better as she'd hung it. I was wrong about the arrangement. He looked at the Springfield. I moved it on Sunday. Fern looked at the painting, the light from the left, the field in the specific week of April. It's better, she said. Yes. She looked at him. He was looking at the painting with the expression that was not grief, exactly. It was something older than grief, the expression of a person who had moved through grief into the territory on the other side, where the person who had gone was still present, but no longer raw. I owe you something, he said. You don't. My mother owed someone for the brick report in 2016. I'm paying it on her behalf. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper, the kind of heavy paper that came from a serious notebook. He set it on the frame of the painting in the narrow ledge where the molding met the wall. I found it in her papers last spring. She wrote it the month after the assessment was filed. She never sent it. Fern looked at the paper. She did not pick it up immediately. She wrote it to the assessment company, he said. Not to you specifically. She didn't know your name. He paused. I thought you should have it. She picked up the note. The handwriting was loose and angular, the handwriting of a person who wrote quickly and meant everything they wrote. The note was 4 sentences. It thanked the assessment team for the recommendation against the drywall. It said that the brick had been the reason she'd been able to persuade her son that the building was worth keeping. It said she hoped whoever had written the words, structural irreplaceability, understood how much weight a phrase could carry when it arrived at the right moment. The 4th sentence said, buildings remember being looked after. I believe the ones that last know they have been. Fern read it twice. She folded it along its original crease. She held it. She sounds like my father, she said. Gideon looked at her. Tell me about your father, he said. It was not a polite request. It was the request of someone who actually wanted to know. So she told him. She told him about the carpenter who believed buildings had preferences, and the theory about light, and the way he had stood at the edge of a room she was assessing once, when she was 25, and he'd come with her on a site visit as a treat, because he wanted to see how she worked. And he had said afterward, without any preamble, that building is trying to stay. You're going to help it. She told him about the January 8 years ago, the phone call from her mother, the drive through a Winnipeg winter that had seemed, that morning, entirely indifferent to the fact that she needed it to be slower. She told him that her mother had given her, the following spring, one of the small squares of walnut he had kept on his workbench, the test cuts he made when he was sizing up a new piece of wood. She kept it on her desk. Gideon listened. He listened the way he looked at things, with the flat-palmed, unhurried attention of someone who had decided that this was worth the full investment of his presence. He did not look at his phone. He did not look at his watch. When she finished, he said, he was right about the building. He was right about most of them, she said. They stood in the north corridor for a long time. The Springfield was in the center of the wall where it belonged. The amber fixtures lit the old brick below it in the warm, patient way of something that had been waiting a long time to do exactly this. The trust documentation, Gideon said eventually, will take some months to finalize. The board will need to be constituted. The provincial heritage designation has its own timeline. He paused. I'm told that the heritage conservationist who filed the foundational assessment typically serves on the advisory body if they're willing. Fern looked at the note in her hand. She thought about the woman who had driven a borrowed pickup truck from Brandon with 2 paintings and talked a gallery on Portage into hanging them in the back room. I'm willing, she said. Good, he said. There was nothing in the word except what it meant. She thought for one brief moment about Paul, who had sat at a kitchen table in September and told her they had arrived at different ideas. She thought about how she had held her coffee and not argued, because there had been nothing to argue. He had been in his way correct. The ideas had been different. She had known it and had been hoping it wasn't the kind of different that mattered. She thought about Gideon Marsh, who had stood at a table in a room full of people and asked whether he could stand there while he figured out where he was going, who had answered questions with specificity, who had moved a painting on a Sunday because he had been wrong about the arrangement. I have a question, she said. He waited. The painting of the table, she said. The interior with the 2 chairs. She looked at him. Did you paint it after or before? He understood what she was asking. She could see it in the small shift of his expression. After, he said, 3 months after. I couldn't work for a long time. He paused. When I could finally work again, that was the first thing I painted. I didn't plan it. It arrived the way things arrived when you'd been not working long enough. Fern nodded. She thought about the 2 chairs, one pushed in, one pulled out. She thought about what it meant that he had painted the occupied chair as the one that was pushed in, the one that belonged to the person who had left the room, not the person still sitting in it. She's not gone from it, Fern said quietly. No, Gideon said. She's not. The gallery held its hush. Outside, Arthur Street carried its February traffic, indifferent and ordinary. Inside, the Springfield was in the center of the wall, and the light in it came from the left, and whoever was paying attention to the specific week of a specific April that it depicted would know they were looking at a moment someone had found worth keeping. He walked her to the door at 1:30. At the top of the small marble step in the thin winter light, she turned. The East Wing, she said. The report I filed in 2019. The city heritage officer at the time filed a counterbrief. I read the counterbrief, he said. He had a small, dry expression. He used the phrase acceptable aesthetic deviation 4 times. I wrote a response, she said. I didn't submit it. I thought it might be too much, too honest, she said. He looked at her for a moment with the expression that was adjacent to a smile. Send it to me, he said. I've been looking for the right document to put in front of the new heritage officer. He might not appreciate it. She, he said. The new officer is a she. She started in January. I'm told she has a particular fondness for the phrase architectural illiteracy. Fern looked at him. He looked at her. It was a level, unhurried look, the look of 2 people who had stopped pretending they were only talking about buildings. All right, she said. She went down the step. She walked to her car. She drove the 4 blocks toward her office on Bannatyne and pulled over on a side street and sat for a moment with the folded note from Evelyn Marsh on the passenger seat beside her, the walnut square from her father's workbench in the cup holder where she kept it, and the particular quiet of a February afternoon in a city that was, beneath all its cold, a place of people who had decided to stay. She pressed her thumbnail into her fingertip. It was a soft press. She thought about the Springfield and the light from the left and the specific week in April that someone had paid close enough attention to make permanent. She put the car in drive. She went back to work. The heritage designation came through on a Wednesday in late April, 12 weeks after she had filed the preliminary report. The Provincial Heritage Office sent the formal notification by post, the old-fashioned way, because Category A designations were considered significant enough to warrant paper. She was in the middle of an inspection report on a 1930s apartment block in River Heights when her phone rang. It was Gideon. It came through, he said. I know. I got the notification this morning. The heritage officer wants to schedule a public announcement. He paused. She suggested the building itself. She thought the gallery would be an appropriate venue. It would be, Fern said. I told her I'd need to consult with the project conservationist. You can consult with the project conservationist now, Fern said. The project conservationist agrees? The project conservationist thinks the gallery is the right room for it, she said. Your mother's work should be on the walls when the designation is announced. It seems like the correct order of things. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was receiving something. Then he said, yes, it does. The announcement was held on a Tuesday evening in May, the same night of the week as the opening in February, by coincidence or by his design. She didn't ask. The room was smaller than the opening night crowd, but it was full of the right people. The heritage officer, the trust lawyers, the board members Gideon had spent 3 months quietly assembling. Annette was there, because Fern had told her about it, and Colin was there, and the 2 of them stood at a table near the east wall, with a proprietary satisfaction that Fern found on this occasion entirely tolerable. Her mother had driven down from Brandon for the occasion. Sylvia Calloway, who had been a librarian for 30 years and had the particular quality of attention librarians develop toward things that deserve to last, stood in front of Evelyn Marsh's Springfield for a long time without speaking. When she came away from it, she set her hand on Fern's arm and said, Your father would have liked this room very much. I know, Fern said. He would have liked the brick. I recommended it, Fern said, years ago, against the drywall. Sylvia looked at her. She looked at Gideon Marsh, who was across the room talking to the heritage officer with the flat-palmed, unhurried attention he brought to every conversation. She looked back at Fern. She said nothing, which was sometimes the most precise thing a person could say. The formal part of the evening was brief. The heritage officer spoke. Gideon spoke, clearly and without ceremony, about his mother and the trust and the building's 1880s sub-foundation, which he described as the thing that made the rest possible. He did not look at Fern when he said it. He did not need to. Afterward, when the room had thinned to the people who belonged there, he came to find her at the north wall. They stood in front of the spring field. "The Trust Board meets for the first time in June," he said. "The first item on the agenda will be the gallery's 10-year programming plan." "That's a significant first item." She left notes. He looked at the painting. 40 pages of notes on what she wanted the space to do. I've been carrying them around for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to take them out. Fern thought about her father's walnut square in the cup holder of her car, about the things a person carried because they were not yet ready to set down, and how the readiness offered not all at once but in small, measured steps, like light moving through a room. "June," she said. "June," he said. He turned from the painting. He set his palm flat on the wall, beside it, the way he set his palm against surfaces. A habit so consistent she had come to understand it was not unconscious. It was a way of steadying a thing. "Can I take you to dinner?" he said. "After the board meeting. Or before. Or entirely separately from it. I've been trying to work out how to ask for 3 months, and I've concluded that the straightforward method is probably the most efficient." Fern looked at him. He looked back at her with the careful, direct expression of a man who had asked a question and intended to wait, as long as it took, for an accurate answer. She thought about the opening night, the round table. 2 empty chairs and a man who had asked whether he could stand at the end of the table while he figured out where he was going. She thought about the note in Evelyn Marsh's loose, angular handwriting. "Buildings remember being looked after." "Before," she said. "Take me to dinner before." He inclined his head, a small, contained acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of someone who did not make a production out of things that had already been decided. They were still at the north wall when Annette appeared at Fern's shoulder, having clearly been waiting for exactly this lull in conversation. She looked at Gideon. She looked at Fern. She said, "I'm going to go find Colin, who is probably in the basement looking at the limestone and doesn't know we've been allowed down there." "You've been allowed down there," Fern said. "Tell him to touch nothing." Annette went. The room moved around them in the easy rhythm of an evening settling into its final hour. The Springfield held its light, exactly as it had in the specific week of April, when someone had stood in front of a window and decided the moment was worth keeping. Fern thought, briefly, and without any particular alarm, that she had not pressed her thumbnail into her fingertip once all evening. She thought she would mention it to Annette in the morning. She thought she wouldn't,